Voting Theory Class 9 Video 1. In this video we're going to begin to talk about fairness principles. So we've been talking about voting systems for a while now, and if you recall, a voting system is any set of rules or algorithm which takes a voting profile and outputs a societal ranking. So it's a way of determining the societal ranking based on how everyone voted. Okay, and we've mentioned that there are many different types of voting system. We've also mentioned some of the most famous ones like dictator, plurality, two-round runoff, instant runoff, agenda, border, and Baldwin. But there are way more. There are so many and so many. And what we want to begin doing now is we want to begin to analyze these different voting systems. And ideally, the ultimate goal in voting theory is to say which one is the best, which voting system is the most fair, is the most democratic, which voting system should we use. The issue with this sort of question is that it's an extremely difficult question to answer. You may think that you have some sort of intuitive notion of what fair or democratic means, but trying to write a mathematically precise definition of what a fair voting system is or what a democratic voting system is basically impossible. Okay? So instead, what mathematicians and political scientists and economists have done is they've created many fairness principles. And a fairness principle is sort of just like a precise mathematical property which they want the voting system to have. Okay? Let's move on to the definition and some examples. So a fairness principle is just a particular property that a voting system may have. It's often considered desirable for the voting system to satisfy this fairness principle. Okay? And in general, the idea is fairness principles measure how fair a voting system is. Okay? It's an extremely difficult and hazy question to ask, is this voting system fair? Because that's just not a mathematically concise concept. So instead, you make fairness principles which are mathematically concise, and then you ask, does the voting system have this fairness principle? Okay? And there are many different fairness principles, because people are always trying to capture some new property or aspect which they think the voting system should have. So there are many different types of fairness principles, and for this class and the next couple classes we're going to go through some of the most important ones. Some of them are quite simple, quite straightforward, and some of them are much more complex. Let's just start with the easy ones. So this is the first fairness principle I want to talk about. We say that a voting system is egalitarian if it treats all of the voters equally. Okay? A voting system is egalitarian if it treats all of the voters equally. This seems like a perfectly natural thing to ask for in an election, right? Like, you want all the voters, their votes, to be counted equally. So that's what it means to be egalitarian. So I will say that all of the voting systems that we've mentioned so far are egalitarian. Well, except for dictatorship. Right? Dictatorship is like the most un-egalitarian voting system that you can think of. There's just one voter, the dictator, which completely determines the outcome of the election, and everyone else's votes aren't considered at all. Okay? Not all the voting systems used in the world are egalitarian, especially when voting systems get more complex. It's often easy for this egalitarian condition to not be satisfied. So, for example, the US presidential elections, the way the US presidential elections work is via the Electoral College, right? So every state has a certain number of electoral votes. But the important thing to note is it's not purely determined by the population of the state. The number of electoral votes a state is assigned is not purely determined by the population of the state. There's also other factors, like you don't want small states to be overpowered by big states. So like this was a deliberate effort. Okay, but the consequence of this means that somewhere like New York has more than 600,000 people per electoral vote, whereas somewhere like Wyoming has less than 200,000 people per electoral vote. So that means that one vote in Wyoming is worth more than 3 votes in New York in terms of the power to influence who wins the presidential election. Wyoming vote is worth more than 3 New York votes. Okay, obviously this is an oversimplification. There's all sorts of other issues going on, like the issue between a safe state and an unsafe state and stuff like this. But this is a good example of a non-egalitarian election voting system that exists in the real world. Okay, the next fairness principle I want to talk about is something called neutral. So neutral, a voting system is neutral if all of the alternatives are treated equally. This is like the dual to egalitarian. Egalitarian says all the voters are treated equally. Neutral says all the alternatives are treated equally. Okay, and maybe I should say all of the voting systems that we've mentioned so far are neutral except agenda. Right? Because if you remember, in agenda you can have situations where it's much harder for one alternative to win. Like in this agenda right here, it's harder for A to win than for D to win. For D to win, D just needs to win 1 head-to-head, whereas for A to win, A needs to win 4. So this agenda is not a neutral agenda, because D, the alternative D, has an advantage over the alternative A. And again, in the real world, there's lots of examples where the voting system is not neutral, and there's often a good reason for it not to be neutral. So I'm not saying that all of these fairness principles should be desired at all times. I'm just saying that some smart people at one point in history have said these are good fairness principles which should be used as a metric to measure and to compare voting systems. But I'm not saying that they should always be sought after. For example, some referendums are based on the plurality, but they require 2/3 of a vote to pass. Okay, and this is a perfectly natural thing to do, I think. Like some referendums, like amending the constitution or something like this, you need more than 50% in favor to pass. You need like a 2/3 vote or a 3/4 vote. You need a bigger majority than 50%. So that means this is not a neutral vote. It's not a neutral voting system, because it's harder for the referendum to pass than it is for the it's harder for the referendum to pass than it is for the referendum to fail. So it's not a neutral voting system. Okay, the last fairness principle which I want to talk about in this video is a very simple one. It's just called no dictator. So a voting system has the no dictator property if there is no dictator. This is it's almost like it seems like stupid to write this down, but this is what it is. Okay, and obviously all of the voting systems which we've spoke about so far have the no dictator property apart from the dictatorship voting system. The dictatorship voting system does not have the no dictator fairness principle. Okay, but I'm not going to waste my time by writing that down because it's so obvious. That's the end of this video.